Good afternoon. I am Hannah Elko-Myers, Director of the Manhattan Institute's Initiative on Policing and Public Safety. Perhaps hidden among all the world-changing events in the past few years has been a precipitous rise in virulent anti-Semitism. Just in 2019, worldwide, there was an 18% increase in major violent cases, including attacks on 53 synagogues and on 28 schools and community centers. According to the FBI in the U.S. that year, over 60% of anti-religious hate crimes targeted Jews, who make up about 2% of the population. And here in New York City in 2019, NYPD reported 234 anti-Semitic hate crimes, representing a full 26% bump over 2018. And the Anti-Defamation League reported over 50 New Yorkers violently assaulted just for being Jewish. The numbers in early 2020 indicated that we were off to an equally bad year had the pandemic not artificially and temporarily suppressed these crimes. And of course, American Jewry is waking up to the horror of active shooter events, such as the 2019 lethal attack at a kosher grocery store in Jersey City, and the deadly synagogue shootings at the Chabad of Poway in California that year, and at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh the year before. And of course, these numbers do not even capture the trends in anti-Semitic sentiment, but only some of the violent manifestations. 2020 represented an enormous uptick in Jewish conspiracy theories accepted by the mainstream, as well as a coalescing of online extremists around anti-Semitic narratives. For example, a survey showed that in Great Britain, a full 1 in 5 people blamed Jews for the coronavirus pandemic. Anti-police protests and civil unrest further attracted and amplified anti-Semitic agendas, including looting and defacing of Jewish businesses and institutions. And under the banner of radical change, groups have unleashed hate against Jews and police alike. Sadly, in 2021, rioters who stormed the U.S. Capitol building last week wore brazenly morbid anti-Semitic slogans. All of this represents an urgent security need to protect Jews and Jewish institutions. What role do local police departments have in this? And how does that compare to their analogs overseas? How do all the challenges facing the police departments right now impact their very ability to combat anti-Semitism? We are incredibly fortunate today to have 2 guests who are experts not only in policing, but in the unique threats of anti-Semitism. Besides working together at NYPD, Ray Kelly and Mitch Silber have spent the last several years undertaking privately funded research across Europe, speaking with the heads of law enforcement, top government officials, and civil society leaders about the state of anti-Semitism and how best to protect communities. Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to invite viewers at home to please drop questions into the chat boxes on whatever platform you are watching, like as viewed right now, and I will do my best to weave them in. We are so immensely honored today to have Ray Kelly with us, who has held 25 different command positions at the NYPD before serving for 14 years as commissioner under 2 non-consecutive mayors. Following the 9/11 attacks, he created the first counterterrorism division within a U.S. municipal police department, as well as a real-time crime center. He also served our country in the Marine Corps, including active combat tour in Vietnam, which he describes vividly in his book, Vigilance, before he retired as a colonel. Commissioner Kelly was Senior Managing Director of Global Corporate Security at Bear Stearns. He served as Commissioner of the U.S. Customs Service and as Undersecretary for Enforcement at the U.S. Treasury Department. Additionally, he earned a JD from St. John's University School of Law, an LLM from NYU Graduate School of Law, and an MPA from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He is a distinguished visiting fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and CEO of Guardian Group, an intelligence and security consulting firm. So glad you are here. We also are fortunate to have Mitch Silber, who is the Executive Director of the Community Security Initiative, the newly created body responsible for securing and protecting Jewish institutions across the greater New York City area, which is no small endeavor. He, before that, served as Director of Intelligence Analysis at the NYPD, where I had the honor to serve under Mr. Silber and Ray Kelly, and co-authored the NYPD report, Radicalization in the West, the Homegrown Threat. He's also the author of the important book, The Al-Qaeda Factor, Plots Against the West. Mr. Silber is a visiting lecturer at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, where he teaches a course on modern urban terrorism, and he is a regular commentator on political risk and terrorism-related issues. I'm delighted to have you both here.
Thank you, Hannah.
Commissioner Kelly, can you please open by telling us about your research in Europe?
Sure. Thank you, Hannah, and thank Manhattan Institute for having us. A couple of years ago, Ronald Lauder, the president of the World Jewish Congress and someone who's devoted virtually all of his adult life to fighting anti-Semitism, asked me to do an assessment of anti-Semitism in Europe with an eye towards making specific recommendations that would help make the Jewish diaspora safer. He was looking for concrete recommendations, not just another assessment saying that anti-Semitism is up. We know it's up in Europe. That wasn't the question. What can we do to make a difference? So I accepted that challenge, and I set about establishing a team. And of course, I went right back to the NYPD and my experiences. I reached out to David Cohn. David Cohn is a 35-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency and 12 years head of our intelligence operations in the NYPD. Agreed to join immediately, and I reached out to Mitch Silber. And you know, Hannah, you work for both of these individuals. They're just top flight professionals. So we came together. We had some help from lots of the sort of expats who were in the United States. We started our research, trying to determine where we should go and who we should talk to, what the questions should be. So we did just that. We decided to do in-depth examination on, in essence, 11 countries. It was 10 plus 1 Turkey. We decided not to physically go there. But the other countries were Belgium, the Ukraine, Denmark, France, the United Kingdom, Hungary, Austria, Denmark, Poland, Turkey, which we did from afar, and Sweden. So we assembled a listing of people that we thought would be helpful for us to speak to. And Mitch Silber did fantastic work on setting up our appointments. Just imagine trying to set up appointments in 10 countries, don't speak the same language. As I said, we had a lot of help from expats in the United States, but we visited these countries. We spoke to former prime ministers, elected officials, heads of the Jewish organizations, chief rabbis in various countries. We actually walked the streets in hotspots, and we wore yarmulkes on the street to see what's the reaction. So the result was, certainly in my opinion, a comprehensive examination of where anti-Semitism is today, or at the time we finished the report, and what can be done to make the diaspora safer. However, we are not going to publish this report. And here's why. Part of our report early last year leaked out in Europe, and it caused a furor. It was seen as being very political, and probably the biggest question that was raised was, who do you think you are, Americans, coming here to Europe and tell us how to fix our problems when you, in fact, have similar problems, at least in the United States? So we realized that a sort of an in-your-face report was not going to change anything at all. It was going to be immediately rejected. We decided that each country's problems, each country's findings, and then each country's recommendations would be delivered by Ronald Lauder personally. He has tremendous contacts throughout Europe, and that's what the plan was. However, COVID broke out just shortly after that, and it certainly slow down that process. But I want to tell you some of our sort of overarching findings. I'm not going to mention specific countries because I think it just will add fuel to the fire. But the overarching finding is that anti-Semitism, no surprise, is higher in Europe now than perhaps any time since World War II. Polls show that over a third of the Jews in Europe would leave if they could, would move because of safety concerns. We also found that the governments were not acting appropriately or giving sufficient resources to protect the Jewish diaspora from the current threat. And we also found that the Jewish community did not have the infrastructure, did not have the resources, did not have the people to adequately protect itself. Now, anti-Semitism manifests itself in many different ways throughout Europe. In some places, it's very aggressive, and the chance of being assaulted is high. In other countries, it's more subtle, and it's more likely to be harassment or a sneer or a stare, that sort of approach. But we certainly saw, and I think consensus, that anti-Semitism is growing in Europe. Now, I can tell you some of the recommendations that we made. We recommended in certain countries the specific placement of police personnel based on historical data that we looked at specific locations that we thought would lower the tension. We also recommended the founding of hate crimes units, because in countries where they enforce hate crimes, they usually investigate with regular investigators, detectives. We believe that you need that expertise, you need that focus on those crimes to be able to adequately investigate them. And we also recommended that we have operation centers in certain countries, ideally with the view down the road of having an operation center for all of Europe. So the Jewish community can report anti-Semitism acts and it be accurately recorded, which it certainly is now. There's no reliable way of capturing the information as to what happens as far as affecting the Jewish community, and also the capability of monitoring cameras, of monitoring the apps, the safety apps that are now growing. That sort of thing would be very helpful. So those are just some of the recommendations that we made. I may be taking too much time, Anna, but I just want to tell you that we operated under five principles that we put in on a report. And I think Mitch is really using these principles and now. First is vigilance. Every Jewish person has to see himself as a potential target, and every Jewish institution as well. You can no longer have open access to Jewish institutions, is our opinion. We saw with the Tree of Life attack in October of 2018 in Pittsburgh, and 6 months of the day later, the attack at the Shabbat Lubavitch house in Poway, open and available entry into both of these facilities. Volunteers in Europe, you'll see a lot more volunteers helping their synagogues, helping their institutions. We don't have that here. We think it's something that needs to be done. Technology, it's come way down in price as far as security technology. I think that every facility has to have a minimum of access control, maybe a double door setup. It must have a radio system of some sort and cameras, and a relationship with the police. Training, you have to train the congregations. You have to do certainly drills as far as active shooters are concerned, tabletop exercises. And lastly, perhaps most importantly, partnership with other institutions, particularly with the police. The police are, I think, a very valuable adjunct to protecting any Jewish institution. I'm going to stop there, and we can answer any questions later on.
Thank you. What incredible and wide-ranging work. Mr. Silber, can I ask, I guess, two questions inspired by that? Do you think that the rise that you saw in all the 11 countries you looked at and with various manifestations, is this something, is it the same causes sort of worldwide, or somehow the same zeitgeist that could cause such a global rise, or is it very individual to each, and each one is completely independent in their reasons, each country?
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks so much for you and Manhattan Institute having me here today. You know, in Europe, one of the things that the commissioner and I saw was that in every country, anti-Semitism was a little bit different in terms of, you know, where did it originate from? Is it coming from the ultra-progressive left? Is it coming from Islamist sources? Is it coming from the far right? And in some countries, they had a combination where it was 2 out of 3 or even 3 out of 3. So, you know, the anti-Semitism has to be looked at from what type of wellspring does it originate. You know, one thing that seemed to potentially be in the background, no matter what the or point of origin was for the anti-Semitism, what were grievances that certain groups had. And I think some of that is still some of the hangover from the 2008-2009 financial crisis. People still feeling like they haven't gotten back to where they were before. But clearly, one of the other elements that's in play is social media. And, you know, all of the conversations that are now on hyperspeed since last Wednesday about banning content on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube, you know, the commissioner and I were in a number of meetings with former government officials, former interior ministers of countries who said, listen, the anti-Semitism in our country is being hosted on Facebook, is being hosted on Twitter. You know, what can we do? The U.S. definition of free speech is so expansive that this is coming into our country like a fire hose and can't be stopped. So, you know, social media has provided a conduit, has provided an ability to amplify those messages, and not regulated has really sort of taken language and discussion that really would sort of be left in the sewers and elevated it into the public domain. So I think some of those different factors, you know, that we saw in Europe certainly crossed the Atlantic here, you know, in terms of social media, in terms of certain segments of the population having grievances, maybe economic grievances, and also this sort of, you know, the issue of what is the truth, and the fact that when truth becomes something much more subjective, it's an opportunity for conspiracy theories to really run rampant. And I think you take those three different factors: grievance, social media, and you know, the rise of conspiracy theories. That's a dangerous combination for Jews, and, you know, partially what's fueling the anti-Semitism in the U.S.
Wow. The social media aspect of that, did in your speaking with people and since, were you finding people suggesting solutions to this real conundrum that we're facing over free speech and the spreading of hate online, especially since of grievances and the other factor, conspiracy theories and social media? Is social media the one place where police could have a role? Well, that was a follow-up for Mr. Silber, and then
Okay. I think in terms of, you know, what we were hearing from these government officials were in Europe, where free speech isn't quite so expansive. There are limitations on free speech. They obviously wanted to see the U.S. find some way to clamp down. And really what they were hoping for was terms of service. You know, at the end of the day, Twitter,
There was a
And
slight
yeah.
freeze.
So, they wanted those companies to crack down. And in fact, some of these government ministers had gone out to Palo Alto and requested those companies, do something more to regulate or limit the hate speech.
Commissioner Kelly, as you went around Europe and suggested ways to create dedicated hate crime units to local police departments, I'd like to know how their conception of what a hate crime is maybe differs from here or is evolving, and also to what extent the different formations of local versus national in the different countries in terms of law enforcement played into how you recommended they better police anti-Semitism.
Right. We haven't really made these recommendations. As I said, we've withdrawn making the recommendations, but what we saw was a lack of expertise when in fact they were doing investigations. And by the way, there are certain countries that resist doing these types of investigations. So they just lack the expertise, or quite frankly, if I had to use one word to describe the police and their approach to anti-Semitism in Europe, it's lethargy. There's no energy. Now, some countries are better than others, and quite frankly, some localities are better in the same country. But the police are not champing at the bit to go out there and make arrests for hate crimes. So it's we'll have to see how the recommendations are accepted. But clearly, there was not the energy that I would have liked to have seen in doing hate crimes investigations.
And do you foresee these increased security around Jewish locations? Is that something that you think is a forever situation? Is it a sort of a baseline capability that Jewish locations should have and will need to use more or less at different times, or it's just sort of the smart thing to do for the foreseeable?
I think it's a smart thing to do, and I think it's basically for all time. I mean, anti-Semitism has been around for a couple thousand years. In my own opinion, we're not going to change people's views, because the causes of anti-Semitism are illogical. There's no reason you can say specifically, they talk about the blood libel and who killed Jesus, this type of thing. And those reasons still surface. So I think Jewish institutions have to think about defense. And some of the things I said before, you need basic elements of defense. Now, you need a camera system, you need a radio system. And one of the things that we were very much aware of and don't see in this country that much, although it's changing, is the double door system. In Europe, if you're going to go into a synagogue, generally speaking, you go into one room, the door closes before the next door opens. So it gives someone, security person, the ability to do a check, to talk to you, ask a question. We don't see that here, although Mitch and JCRC, I know, are certainly working in that direction. But I see this as something that, quite frankly, is overdue. I don't think the threat is going to lessen. I think it's only going to get worse. We saw some of the indications of that even with the demonstrations on January 6th. So no, I mean, I think it's here to stay.
That is incredibly depressing, but so important to be aware and take action. Another sort of policing structure question. NYPD is perhaps unique in that it has a hate crimes task force in the Detectives Bureau, and then it has an intel unit that focuses on trying to look ahead, looking online at extremists, and focusing on interdicting future potential attacks. Is this a dual setup that you've seen in other police departments? Is it something that they all should have? Is it something that in the U.S. even smaller police departments should be looking at, given the rise in extremism that manifests in anti-Semitism, but also in other kinds of attacks?
Well, I think it's great. I think this unit, the second unit, which is racial and ethnic motivated extremism, REME is the acronym for it. It only started 2 years ago. And what it really does is sort of look over the horizon. Now, you talk about the hate crimes task force. Yes, they do retrospective investigations. They're looking at events that happened that's reported to them. But this unit is very proactive, is looking throughout the country, not just in New York, because quite frankly, relatively speaking, the neo-Nazi movement, the white extremist movement is not really a Northeastern phenomenon. Does it exist? Yes, but it's not to the same extent it does in other parts of the country. And they have helped other police departments in doing this. They've used undercovers, for instance. I'm not at liberty to give all the details. Does it exist in other departments? No. But, you have to understand the New York City Police Department has 54,000 employees. It's the biggest by far in the country. And they're really performing a service for the whole country. And it's again, I don't think this was sufficiently looked at by federal law enforcement and certainly local law enforcement previously.
Let me ask you one more policing structure question, and then I'm going to turn back to Mr. Silber. How does your experience of having created this whole counterterrorism capability apparatus following 9/11 inform how you think about this particular threat should be combated?
Well, one of the things that we did post 9/11 is create a very robust intelligence unit in the department. We were aggressive in that regard. Hannah, you yourself participated in that, and I think David Cohen and Mitch Silber did a terrific job in developing our capability. So I think some of that intelligence capacity can be directed, and I believe through REME is being directed at anti-Semitism speech and actions throughout the country and even throughout the world. I think they are going into the dark web, the deep web, and looking for this type of verbiage, any indication that will lead to violence. Look, there's a lot we don't know, but I think through the counterterrorism regimen that we put in place, I think there was a lot to learn there, and I believe they're using it in this new unit. So I'm encouraged by that.
Thank you, Mr. Silber. How has in the U.S. this year all of the protests, the civil unrest, how has that specifically impacted your work securing Jewish locations in the greater New York City area?
Well, going back a little bit to the idea of the origin of the anti-Semitism, being a factor, I think, in the greater New York area, the main concern that we faced was less of a white supremacist threat over the last 6 months or so, but really, over the summer when the protests that were going on, devolved in some places into wilding and looting and rioting, that ended up being a situation where we were on the phone, our team, and we're fortunate to have a very talented team of 5 regional security managers, as well as an intelligence analyst, where we had incoming calls from synagogue directors, executives at schools, JCC directors, all very concerned about in what direction are those demonstrators going, and where is the rioting going, so that they were prepared in case they ended up on their doorstep. And the anxiety level reached a point where we had a number of calls where they said, listen, we're thinking about taking our Torahs, out of our synagogue and safeguarding them in some alternative location because we fear that this may get out of control. So on a sort of round the clock for, I'd say, about a week, our team 24/7 was dealing with these set of incoming calls, but also simultaneously monitoring where these demonstrations and protests were going. And sometimes we had to be the connector between NYPD in Far Rockaway and Nassau County PD in the 5 towns, where the possibility that the protesters weren't going to stop at the county line had to be something that we had to factor in, or on the Bronx, Westchester border. So oftentimes our team was sort of, intermediaries, making sure that all of the local police forces were aware that this event was going on, where we thought it might go, and, where the locations that we thought might be in jeopardy could be. So that, I would say, over the last 6 months was probably, when the lights were flashing red for our team.
Is the model that you've created here in New York, and which sounds like it very much sprang from what you figured out made the most sense in Europe, is that something that other cities and urban areas or even rural areas, I'd be even more curious, in the country, have they reached out to you to say, how can we set up something like this to protect ourselves?
Sure. One of the things that, we all saw at NYPD in the intelligence division was that when you create something new in New York City and it has a record of success, people are going to reach out to you. It happened when we were at NYPD from across the country and around the world. And even now here in New York, we're really only 11 months into the Community Security Initiative since its launch. But already, we're in regular conversations with other major cities in the U.S. who've got large Jewish populations to talk about best practices. We're sharing intelligence with them. And there's sort of this ongoing effort to understand what New York's doing. And by the way, it's a two-way street. We don't claim to know everything. We're sort of the new kid on the block. So we're glad to learn lessons from other cities who've been doing this a lot longer and have their own structure. So it's a two-way street. But yeah, for sure, other entities, and I would even say internationally, some of the organizations that the commissioner and I spoke to in Europe have reached out to try and share intelligence and best practices.
Do you think that the unusual density of Jewish institutions and locations and communities in New York makes it an easier area to police and kind of share resources and intelligence? Or is it actually compared to a rural area where there's fewer institutions, you're more on your own, but perhaps can concentrate your energies?
Right. Well, look, in New York, we estimate the Jewish population to be approximately 1.5 million people. So outside the state of Israel, that is by far the single largest concentration of Jews in any area. So by virtue of the size, maybe 2,000 institutions, schools, synagogues, JCCs, museums, it's a vast undertaking with a large population. So it is complicated. And then you've got the diversity. Brownstone, Brooklyn is not Crown Heights. Crown Heights is not, Scarsdale. So you just think about all the different types of Jewish communities that you've got out there. So the diversity is complex as well. But, the good news is that in New York City, in Nassau, in Suffolk, and in Westchester, which is really our area of operations, you've got very capable police forces. And I think that's probably, the ace card that we have up our sleeves, is that our local law enforcement partners are talented, they're knowledgeable, they are motivated, the exact opposite of what we saw in Europe. In fact, just last night, I was on a call with Nassau County, and this was in response to the hacking of the Jewish school on the North Shore, and just mobilized. So, we're very appreciative to have these law enforcement partners, as well as the FBI and DHS, so at the federal level.
Thank goodness. Commissioner Kelly, you have a lot of experience going far back in dealing with policing and anti-Semitism. And I'm curious what you learned about the relationship between the Hasidic community and the Black communities that lived side by side when you were a commanding officer in the 7-1 precinct, which covered Crown Heights 40 years ago.
It seems like 100 years ago, but I would say this, that there was a lot more tension in the community when I was there than there is now. We had things like, for instance, when I was a commanding officer, someone tried to burn down 770 Eastern Parkway, which is the world headquarters of the Lubavitch sect. Actually took a 5-gallon can of gasoline, poured it, lit it, it just didn't go off. And at that time, there were vigilante groups that were in the Jewish community. And for instance, if someone, certainly a young man of color, stole a bike and he was caught, they would assault him, and people were seriously injured. So it was that level of tension. And there's a lot of people responsible for turning it around, but it has a pretty good feeling now. I'm in touch with the Lubavitch community. I work with them on a weekly basis, so I pretty much have a sense of what's going on there. So it is a lot more peaceful. Does it mean it's perfect? No. There's always an element of tension there. But just as you said, on many blocks in Crown Heights, you have African-American family living right next to a Lubavitch family, and all it looks like they're getting along. So yeah, it was a heavy lift in the beginning, and a lot of people did a lot of great work. There was someone by the name of Richard Green who was there. He was there for many years. He just was terrific. He was a peacemaker. He was a conciliator. That type of activity has gone a long way to change the community.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful to hear an injection of something, a positive trend, especially right here in New York in this conversation. Could you also speak for a minute about you were first deputy commissioner during the Crown Heights riots in 1991, and there seemed to be, as I read about it, a swirling together of the rioters shouting down Jews and shouting down police sort of interchangeably in the same breath. And I feel that we have seen some of that. It's been reported that there was a significant amount of that this year at various protests that elevated into riots and got kind of infused with outsiders. Can you tell us about that and how you managed to calm things down and make things more peaceful?
Well, yeah, what that showed, a lot of things we learned from Crown Heights, but it showed me anyway, that we were not prepared to handle disorders, large disorders. The police department would send lots of police officers to a scene. They would stand around, they would hope for the best. There were no tactics or strategies that were used. I wrote a report on Crown Heights. I gave it to then Police Commissioner Lee Brown. He left, I became the commissioner, so basically a report to myself. And what we needed was a lot more training in terms of tactics and strategies to handle disorders. So when I was asked to get involved, we were able to turn around quickly because we brought in appropriate resources. We thought of tactics and strategies. Quite frankly, I think some of the police personnel, the chiefs at the time, were being too politically correct. They would not make the appropriate moves because we had African-American mayor, African-American police commissioner, African-American chief of the department. So they chose to do very little. And we had to straighten it out. Obviously, this is a time for action, and some of them just let that go. So we learned, but it's the type of thing that has to be practiced all the time. It's the type of thing that has to be instilled in police officers' head. When there is a disorder, what do I do? Some basic moves. And again, I think we've seen that that's the type of thing, at least early on in with the George Floyd events, that you have to be able to mobilize and get in place quickly
before things could escalate and serious damage.
Yep, exactly.
You, to piggyback on that, you recently were quoted in the Jerusalem Post talking about the impact of all the anti-police legislation and budgets and various things this year, that this could impact their ability to counter anti-Semitism going forward if just their numbers, their capabilities, their that rejection of lethargy that exists in Europe gets beaten down. Can you talk about that?
Well, I think there's no question about it that police generally in America, certainly in big cities, are sort of on their back foot. They are not engaging in proactive measures that I think have made New York City and other cities safe. But I think in sort of incorporated in that is perhaps a lack of emphasis on protecting Jewish institutions and Jewish people. At the same time, there is real world defunding. We had it in the New York City Police Department, where $1 billion was taken out of their budget, and the headcount has and will continue to be reduced. So there just may not be sufficient people here and in other locations to do what may not be considered to be their prime duty. And I think big cities, and let's face it, the Jewish population in this country is pretty concentrated in New York, Los Angeles, Miami. They may back away from what I see as a responsibility to protect Jewish institutions and Jewish people. So we're going to have to see. We're going to have to see how this all plays out. But I think it's important for members of the Jewish community to be the squeaky wheel, to go to their mayors, to go to their police chiefs or whatever, and keep knocking on the door. We need a police presence at major Jewish events, holy days, that sort of thing. We saw what happened in Halle in Germany, where the police were asked to be at the synagogue on the holiest day of the year, Yom Kippur. They just never showed up. And I'm afraid that type of thing could happen here.
Mr. Silber, you've written a lot about Islamic terrorism, and I believe you listed among these sort of different sources of anti-Semitism in different countries, kind of having different mixes of far left, far right Islamic terrorist inspirations. Can you talk a little bit about, especially relative to your time at NYPD, where that was certainly a large focus, what's the threat landscape from Islamic terrorism? How does that impact anti-Semitism? And is there sort of a bleeding over of allegiances between Islamic terrorists and some of the far right groups where they find this common ground?
Sure. I think right now, one thing we've seen about Islamist terrorism in New York City is that there may be, waves, high points and low points, but it certainly doesn't ever disappear. And right now it seems like, we've shifted into a lower part of the wave where we're just not seeing the frequency of arrests. But that doesn't mean the threat isn't there. And we know that Al-Qaeda and ISIS still have safe havens around the world. And from our time at NYPD, we know that if there's any type of pocket litter you're going to find in the jihadists, when they arrest him, it's usually a subway map of New York or some type of significant, famous landmark in New York. So New York is always on the target list. That threat is there. I think when we're talking about Islamist threats, in sort of a side category, but nevertheless one that we have to be mindful one is Iran and Hezbollah, just because that is a function of politics, a function of where the U.S. and Iran are over nuclear tensions, a function of where Iran and Israel are over nuclear tensions, because we've seen Iran through Hezbollah strike out at Jewish populations around the world, making no difference between Israel and Jewish targets. And we had sent a team down to Argentina to learn about the two attacks down there. So I think that's a threat that's worthwhile keeping our eyes on, especially as things continue to escalate both on the nuclear front and in the Persian Gulf, in general. In terms of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, much of that threat has now transitioned to a homegrown threat where they're not getting direction from the organizations overseas. But remember, we have had some successful attacks in New York City in the last few years. Most importantly, the attack on the West Side Highway, which unfortunately was deadly. 8 people lost their lives. And that truck was taken and crashed into the walkway there. So, that threat definitely still exists. Right now, nationwide, if you read what the Department of Homeland Security has put out in their report from last year, they're saying that right-wing extremism may have eclipsed the Islamist threat by counting plots, counting arrests, counting numbers dead in the last year or so. It definitely is a factor there. And, while we don't have a heavy population that's sympathetic to neo-Nazi and white supremacist views in New York, certainly as you get further away from the city, upstate, rural Pennsylvania, you do start to encounter pockets of support there. And rather than target something in their own area, the most highest likelihood they would come to New York, where there's a Jewish population, where there's the media to essentially give them the notoriety that they want, for their attack. So I would imagine that our former colleagues at NYPD Intelligence Bureau have got their hands full. They're dealing with the Islamist threats. Now this rising tide of right-wing extremism, white supremacist, and some of the leftover protest activity from last summer. So it's sort of, a perfect storm, if you will.
How perfect. During your research in Europe, do you feel that your time in policing and in looking at extremism, did it prepare you for what you're going to see there, or was there something or many things that really surprised you?
Well, I've joked that, thanks to the commissioner, I earned my PhD in European Jewish security during our time traveling in Europe and seeing what was going on in these 10 countries. And actually, if you were looking to prepare someone to start up a new community security effort, de novo from scratch, that would actually be the perfect practice, because you could go and see what some countries were doing well, where some countries were deficient, who had the right partnerships, who needed more resources. So a lot of the learnings that happened in Europe during that time, I've tried to implement here in New York in our own program. So we've definitely been the beneficiaries, of that effort. And I think, when you look at Europe, every country was so different. And, one of the things that I saw that surprised me, and I think that was one of your questions, what surprised me is that you really had to look at the type of government that was in place in a certain country to understand how Jewish security functioned. It turns out it matters if you're a constitutional monarchy and the monarch is also the head of your religious authority, of the church in your country, versus if you are a secular republic where religion is sort of kept out of the public space. Those type of historical features of different European countries really determined how much they were willing to help their Jewish populations, what type of resources they provided, and all of that mattered at the street level, at the Jewish institution level. But who knew you had to go back and study your European history to really understand why it was the case.
And without casting undue light, are there historical setups that are more or less which are better and which are worse at creating systems to protect Jews?
We found that the UK was really the gold standard for Jewish security in all of Europe. And, obviously they're a constitutional monarchy. So the fact that, the Queen, the King, or also the head of the church there allowed them to provide resources to communities of faith without having to navigate some of the difficulties of being in a purely secular state. And that, made a difference in terms of having resources that were at multiples of other countries on the continent.
Wow. It's almost counterintuitive, but fascinating. I want to remind our audience we have 9 minutes left. If someone wants to, people want to send over more questions. I've incorporated questions already from Bill and David, so anyone else, I can try to slip it in under the wire. Since the hour is going so fast. I want to take one step back for one moment, because I can't resist asking Commissioner Kelly, what is your what do you feel is your biggest accomplishment? What gives you the greatest gratification of your time at NYPD?
Well, I think I've been very fortunate to have the jobs that I've had in the federal government, and certainly NYPD NYPD. I'm a product of the department over 40 years, and it's the greatest decision I ever made. But I think I would have to say that as we started the Bloomberg administration, we laid out the 3 C's that we wanted to address, and that was counterterrorism, crime suppression, and community relations. Now, our headcount during the 12 years of the Bloomberg administration reduced by 6,000 police officers. And yet, at the end of Bloomberg in 2013, the department had a 70% approval rating. I had 75% approval rating and 63% approval rating in the African American community. After 11 and a half years, that's I'm proud of that. Crime was reduced. We had a 40% reduction in violent crime and counterterrorism. As you know, Hannah, we constructed a sort of a wide-ranging, very robust counterterrorism operation, both in our counterterrorism unit and intelligence division. And although we had 16 plots against the city during that time, none came to fruition as a result of great work on the part of the NYPD, great work on the part of the FBI, and sheer luck. But we had no terrorist attacks. So I think the 3 C's, I felt comfortable, and I'm proud of what the department did during that 12-year span to keep New York safe.
So we're also grateful. A question just came in from Andrew. He's asking about, with the loss of very experienced officers who are retiring from NYPD and across the country this year, where they have established connections with the communities and the specialized knowledge, which you describe as being so important for police to be effective in this countering anti-Semitism. Is there a particular danger there that it takes us even longer for that knowledge to be replaced? Mr. Silber.
Is that a question for me?
Well, please go ahead. Please go ahead. Commissioner.
I think there is. I think that there's been a very significant brain drain from the department with these retirements after the killing of George Floyd. And I think the loss is felt in middle management more than any place else. Detective commanders or experienced detectives, that sort of thing. They've left in big numbers. And it's very difficult to train people to get up to speed with someone who, let's say, has been a detective for 20, 25 years. That's a real loss. So it is a concern, and it's having an effect in ways that impact on the department's ability to function the way we'd like it to function. But that's just the reality, and that's where we are. And they're doing what they can to make up for that deficiency. Right.
I have a question from our own Judy Miller, who asks, who says, we reported on the elements of your report in France, so that it was that France is facing a lot of challenges with anti-Semitism. Has the situation improved in the past months?
Again, who's that for?
For Mr. Silber. Apologies.
Sure. So, based on what I've been seeing, and in fact, I'm in communication with some people still in France, the situation really has not changed at all for the better. And, as we all know, there were these horrific slayings, of the teacher and of this woman in a church. So, Islamist violence within France continues unabated. There was just an incident a couple weeks ago during Hanukkah when a couple was humming Hanukkah songs in their car, and the car was assaulted. And yes, those are sort of anecdotes, but writ large, the situation of France is still not, a safe place for Jews, in my personal opinion. And there will continue to be a steady trickle of people who are leaving for whether it's Miami, Montreal, or Israel. In this environment with heightened tensions.
Well, we have 4 more minutes, so I'd like to ask you both and to take a minute each, starting with the commissioner. Any final thoughts? We have yet again failed to solve anti-Semitism, but we are all so much better off for understanding the threat and how to protect ourselves. So, Commissioner.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the focus that the Jewish world needs to engage in now. Defense, protecting itself, protecting its institutions. As I said before, the 2 assaults on the synagogues, the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh and the Shabbat Lubavitch House in Poway, they were open environments. We have to think now of ways to protect the community. At this particular point in history, I think the danger is real. I think anti-Semitism in this country has increased. Very difficult to measure. I believe that it's always underreported. But you can see, as you said, Hannah, in the beginning, how it's gone up not only here but throughout the world. So defense, protection. Contrary to, I know, the philosophy of Judaism, to be open and to be welcoming, I think we have to pause in that regard for where we are now in history.
Thank you. It's important to hear, even though it's difficult. Mr. Silber, last thoughts?
Yeah, I know. I would say that in many ways, I have a similar viewpoint from the standpoint that anti-Semitism has been around forever, and we've trying to combat it is certainly a worthwhile endeavor. But for the moment, and certainly my particular focus is on preventing violent anti-Semitism, because that's the one you don't recover from. Slurs in the street, graffiti, those are all signposts potentially on the way to violent activity. Even stickering, people putting anti-Semitic stickers in Sleepy Hollow, in Tarrytown, in Westchester, we've been tracking the last few weeks. All of these things, must be tracked, must be counted, and efforts must be made to push back against them. But for my primary focus is on preventing violent anti-Semitism, and frankly, keeping Jews safe and alive. And from there we can move on, hopefully in a less polarized political environment, to challenge some of these ideas that are fueling the anti-Semitism. And maybe we'll have a different tone in the country in the next few weeks. We'll see. But that's where my focus is.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Silber, and thank you, Commissioner Kelly, for keeping us safe and for doing this work that informs us about how to keep ourselves and our neighbors safe. We appreciate it. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for having us.
Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you. Before we close, I would like to invite our public audience, to sign up on our website to receive updates from the Policing and Public Safety Initiative, including information about our upcoming events. We have a fireside chat with former LAPD Chief Charlie Beck on the 4th, for which you can register, as well as a chat with Houston's current police chief, Art Acevedo, at the end of February. On our website, you can also browse the Manhattan Institute's research and subscribe to our newsletters. If you are able, please also consider supporting the Institute at the link you see below. MI is a nonprofit organization, and our work depends on support from people like you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good job.